Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week I had a chance to sit down with YFP co-founder, co-owner, and director of financial planning, Tim Baker, to talk through financial needs and considerations of Generation X, those born between the mid-60s and early 80s, falling between the baby boomers and the millennials. That would be our pharmacy colleagues well beyond the new practitioner phase, but perhaps not yet at that traditional retirement age. So whether you are a student pharmacist or new practitioner anticipating some of the financial opportunities and challenges that may face you in the future, or you're a Gen X pharmacist listening, my hope is that you'll have something to take away and apply to your own personal situation. On the show, Tim Baker and I talk through why this generation has some unique financial challenges and is often referred to as the sandwich generation. We discuss the challenge this generation faces in the balance taking care of themselves, their children perhaps, as well as their parents, how their debt position and accrued retirement savings compares to other generations, as well as some strategies for a Gen X pharmacist to chart a successful path forwards despite some of the challenges that they may be facing. As we wrap up another year of the show and are knee-deep into the planning for 2022, I want to say thank you to the YFP community for entrusting us with your time by listening to the show. We don't take for granted your support and encouragement of the work that we're doing at YFP to help pharmacists on their path towards achieving financial freedom. Also, a big shout out to YFP team members Caitlin Boyle and Rose Mercado, who are the engine behind making the YFP podcast a reality each week. Caitlin and Rose, your contributions to the team and the YFP community are truly appreciated. Okay, let's hear from today's sponsor, and then we'll jump into my conversation with Tim Baker. This week's episode of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast is sponsored by Thoughtful Wills. Let's take a minute to hear from co-founder Nathan.
My name is Nathan Kavli, and I'm one of the founders of Thoughtful Wills. Our law firm spends a lot of time thinking about the process of estate planning. There's no way we can get around the yuck of death, so instead we focus on being lawyers that you'll actually enjoy working with. We pride ourselves on being approachable, and then we take the extra time to draft documents that are actually understandable. Then we pair that with technology to make the process cheaper and more convenient. Please visit our website, thoughtfulwills.com/YFP, and poke around. Then book a meeting with us, please. We are genuinely excited to chat with you.
Tim, excited to have you back on the mic.
Yeah, good to be back for a full episode, Tim. How's it going?
It is going. You know, we are just a couple days away from the new year, and hard to believe that we've had another year of the podcast, another year of the growth of the YFP community, growth of the team at YFP, and so much to be grateful for as we roll the calendar into 2022 and excited for what lies ahead as well.
Yeah, it's been a year of change, I think, with everything that's going on, but I think all for the good. And I'm excited for what 2022 brings. And hopefully we can continue to crawl out of this pandemic and we don't have too many more of the variants that are shutting things down. So I'm excited for what's ahead, though.
So as we're going to start to dig into this topic, one that we haven't covered in great detail before, but today we're talking about the financial needs and considerations of Gen X pharmacists. And I think it's worth noting, Tim, anytime we talk about generations, we're obviously talking in generality and general form. So, certainly unique situations are going to apply here. But tell us a little bit more about why we want to delve more into this topic on the podcast as we look at financial needs and considerations of Gen X.
Yeah, I think just like the generation, it's kind of like the forgotten middle child. So when we're talking about Gen X, we're talking about a group of about 65 million people, that are born between 1965 and 1980. So the youngest, is in their early 40s, turned 41 this year, and then the oldest being in their, mid 50s, turning 56 this year. So it's a big group of people that it's often kind of set on the sidelines when compared to like Gen Y, the millennial generation, or baby boomers. So, but I think it's a generation that probably has some of the most important or some of probably the most urgent need in terms of like their finances and financial planning. So this generation is called the latchkey generation. a lot of kids, after school would go to those latchkey programs. I've also heard them called Oregon Trail generation, the trapper keeper generation. I have a personal affinity.
It's good.
Yeah. So I'm technically part of the Gen Y. I'm an older Gen Y millennial, born in 82. But my brother was born in 80. So he's a young Gen Xer at the end of 80. So I kind of see both. I kind of feel like I fit in between both generations, and I kind of see both sides of it. But it's also often called the sandwich generation, which really entails a Gen Xer taking care of not only themselves but their kids that are kind of coming of age, but also aging parents.
Yeah,
47%, according to Pew, 47% of adults in their 40s and 50s have a parent over age 65 and are either raising a young child or providing financial support to a young child over 18. So you can imagine, Tim, I kind of before I had kids, I'm like, man, I can barely take care of myself. How can I take care of another human being? That's kind of what's going on here as they're adulting, is they got to take care of themselves, and then they have to basically take care of parents and then their kids that are kind of coming of age. So it's a daunting task. And unfortunately, I feel like there's a lot of negativity and cynicism, not just even around like the coverage of Gen X, but even inside of Gen X, as you see, some of the things that they've experienced over time. And it's something that I think needs to be talked about more, because I feel like all of the press, all of the the language is either for, baby boomers or this Gen Y generation, and baby boomers or Gen X are just kind of left on the side.
It's really true. And it's something that I've observed since we were prepping for this episode is when you hear generational news that's out there, the millennials get a lot of love. Gen Z gets, a lot of attention, baby boomers. But, this concept of a sandwich generation, a generation that's often overlooked, but has some significant things that they're facing financially, and hopefully some things that we can turn into opportunities, may get overlooked in terms of the stress and the burden that group is carrying. And so you've laid the foundation, Tim, in terms of Gen X. So people born, again, approximately 1965 to 1980. So we're looking at early 40s to mid 50s, known as the sandwich generation in between millennials and baby boomers. And, that concept of being caught between taking care of their children as well as aging parents. I just talked with a prospective client earlier this week, young family, 2 kids under the age of 4, going through their own student loan debt repayment scenario, trying to get, investing off the ground and get some early momentum there. And then also the prospect of potentially having to take care of their elderly parents in the near future. And so that's weighty, right? I think you and I would both argue from individual experiences as well as the pharmacists that we talk with all across the country, the financial plan can be hard enough in and of itself without having to think about an additional burden that might be placed upon something like having to take care of elderly parents.
Yeah. And I don't think, I think this is the start of many sandwich generations, unfortunately. Yeah. Maybe not unfortunate, but I know a lot of our Gen Y clients are, they have a bucket of money that's just like, hey, my parents, either got me here because they immigrated here or whatever, or just that's what our culture, says is like, my job is to make money and take care. Like I am my parents' retirement plan. And that's not just related just to Gen X. I think that's going to be a common theme in Gen Y and Gen Z. I think the difference is that the year, like it's upon us already for Gen X. Yep. Like they're already doing it and probably haven't really planned for it. The good part about Gen X is that they're approaching their peak earning years. So on average, they make more money. I think the average household income was something like in the 130s or something like that. So on average, they make a lot more than baby boomers who are kind of winding down or they're already retired. And then, Gen Ys are still kind of, and we know in pharmacy, it's a little bit different.
Yep.
Average net worth for the kind of, if you're clocking this average net worth, I think I saw a number out there was about 168,000. So that's not a lot, especially if you're thinking you only have 10 or 20 years left to work if you're going to retire in your 60s, that type of thing. So I think the one thing that kind of came out to me when I was looking at this was 39% of Gen Xers feel that they'll never have as secure as a financial life as their parents' generation. Yeah. Which that's one thing is like as parents, you always want your kids to have a better upbringing, but I think the other thing that is interesting about Gen X as you're looking at the data and just some of the the editorial comments of it, they are a sandwich in terms of like, I feel like they have a lot of the consumerism that baby boomers have. Is like Gen X spends more than any other generation in terms of consumer goods, but they also got hit with the rising cost of education. Now, not to the degree I think where pharmacists are coming out today, and we have charts where, the income was pretty close to what the debt levels are for a PharmD, and then it just the PharmD debt just raced by the income. So I think to a lesser degree, the debt, and obviously they've had years, a decade or more of paying, 15 years of paying off student loans. But I think the biggest portion of what they're seeing in terms of debt loads are coming in the form of like mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, but also still having those student loans. And unfortunately, Tim, we see a lot of pharmacists that are in this generation that haven't put that big of a dent into their student loans at all because of, I think, how the construct of, hey, you just pay the least amount and you drag it on forever. And unfortunately, you're kind of left with a large sum, even, 10, 15, years into your career, 20 years into your career, unfortunately.
Tim, one of the things I was thinking about recently, I graduated in 2008. So what was that now? 13 years ago or so. And that was shortly after the requirement of the PharmD, right? So this group, most of them, unless they went back and got the PharmD, would have been in the BS period before the PharmD was required. But one of the things I've been reflecting upon is that, I graduated in 2008. Obviously, the recession of 2008 was what it was. But I was in residency making $31,000 and didn't have a whole lot of focus or attention on savings. So I didn't really feel that very much, right? Even though I observed it and lived in it. And so all I know is what has been a pretty wild, market ever since then. That's only been, on the up and up, right? Overall, obviously outside of some dips and so forth in between. And so I often think like, man, what kind of overconfidence has that led potentially, not only my situation, but others that are in that window that have graduated within the last, 13 years and have not experienced a significant downturn that has had, that real impact where you've accumulated savings and you're like, oh my gosh, this is real. I see the dip, right? And we look at this generation, they've been through the dot-com bubble. They've been through the 2008 financial crisis, and they've been through what has been the wild last couple of years on the market since the beginning of the pandemic, right? In terms of the ups and downs, and even within a given week, ups and downs. What impact do you suspect that has had in terms of, their approach to savings and investments?
Yeah, I think it's had a great impact. And I think it was often documented that a lot of Gen Xers were very, very much educated, but underemployed, especially like .com and talk about swings of like wealth and markets, .com. And then, the subprime mortgage crisis. I think it's led to a lot of the cynicism and a lot of the, kind of some of the rhetoric that you see. And I guess to kind of bring my point full circle, what I was trying to compare, to go back to that real quick. So baby boomers, no student loan issues there, right? But spent and had, mortgages and things like car loans and things like that, credit card debt. I think notoriously haven't been great about saving for retirement. And I think Social Security is going to definitely help them. I think Gen Y have been more adverse to like home buying and taking on a big mortgage and less consumer debt. Whereas Gen X, you're seeing the ugly on both sides. You're seeing, the student loans, but you're also seeing some of the other debt that's piled on. I think with regard to investments, I think that I saw a stat that Gen Xers, they're thinking, we probably should be, I think the number was like, we probably should be saving 11%. It's probably closer to 20%, where they're at in their career with, if you count all of the things that you should be putting in to retirement. But I think on average, they're saving about 9%. So I think some of the things that you're seeing that baby boomers are working more into retirement and they don't have confidence in, their money lasting. I think you're going to see that compound with Gen X, unfortunately. I think one of the things that often will buoy the Gen Xers is as that wealth generation or wealth transfer happens. So baby boomers die off, you're going to start to see windfalls that are going to kind of fix some of the ills, unfortunately, that to happen, but it's having a plan for that, and having a plan for that windfall. So Gen X wants stability, but they're not necessarily doing a lot to help kind of their financial future. And I think what they're just trying to do is kind of get through the day in terms of like, hey, I have to take care of myself, my parents. But then like, I'm also looking at, and the whole other, we could have a whole other discussion just about education and sending your kids to college and not experience, and sometimes that your own experience can color that for your kids. So you have some people that are like, I never want my kids to have an ounce of student loans. Or some people would say like, hey, I had to deal with it. They have to too. And there's no right or wrong answer, but it's really kind of cutting through that and understanding what can you do for your kids? What do you want to do for your kids in terms of education plan? And at the end of the day, your retirement should take precedence because you can't take retirement loans. You can take, education loans, and hopefully they start to figure out like how to make this a little bit better, which again, it doesn't necessarily help. It might help our kids, Tim, in the future, but it's not going to help Gen Xers whose kids are in college or are approaching that age right now.
Yeah. Jess and I were just talking about that the other night, of really fighting against, some of that gut and emotional reaction to want to potentially over contribute on the college side at the expense of other things because of the pain we felt, right, in our own journey and how front and center that is.
Well, and I just got an email from Ohio 529. They're like, hey, if you put this much in, you can max out your $4,000
end of year, right?
And I'm like, all right, well, we have this plan, but I'm like torn to like say like, okay, like how can I get that just for the tax benefit? And again, I think people sometimes do things for the good of their taxes that are at the detriment of their financial plan. I mean, it's never a bad thing to, I think, save for a future expense that hopefully will be there in the form of college. But at the same time, like I had to kind of take a step back and say like, well, this is not really what Shay and I talked about in terms of like what we want to do. And we kind of followed that 1/3 plan, which I think we've outlined in previous episodes of, 1/3 is going to come from the 529s that we're saving. 1/3 is going to come from, hopefully that's something I can cash flow as, our kids are in college. So like that present income in the future, if that makes sense. And then 1/3 from hopefully scholarships, grants, and then last but not least, loans. So that's ours. And again, at the end of the day, we're making sure that we're trying to fill the retirement buckets because we want options. Like we want options as we approach retirement to say, okay, like we want to work until this or not have to work or whatever. So to me, that's something that the Gen X generation is also dealing with. But I think again, it's more to a heightened degree. One, because I think resources are scarce and you're just dividing up between many more people because you typically bigger households. And then we talked about, again, taking care of parents and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it goes back to, I think, relying on the act of planning, versus having a plan. I think that's definitely something that, Gen Xers should look to do. And if they're kind of grappling with all these different issues.
Yeah. And I think as we've talked about, many times on the show and something I know we both worked through personally, and I sense it in the individuals that we talk to that are considering coming on board as clients of YFP planning. Sometimes there's just so much emotional stress that we carry around related to the financial plan because of all of these things that are swirling in our mind, right? We've talked about many of them here as it relates to Gen X in terms of, debt that might be hanging around, thinking about the college for kids or grandkids, caring for elderly parents, am I behind on retirement? Should I be thinking about diversifying other revenue streams? And the list goes on, right? And so much value from my perspective of the planning process and what you've done even with Jess and I is let's get all of these out of our head onto paper. Let's talk through them. Let's prioritize them. Let's beat them up. Think about how they fit in with the bigger vision of the plan and where we're trying to go, what we're going to try to do. And even if those numbers don't change drastically tomorrow, right, we'll get there over time. But having that plan just provides an incredible amount, I think, of confidence and hopefully at some level, some peace as well.
Yeah. And it just, the plan touches so many things. So like we touched briefly on, the investment and retirement stuff. And you could talk about just that whole thing for Gen Xers is like, okay, what does retirement look like? Is it early? Do we have dollars that we can access if it is early retirement? If it's not, like, what's the plan for that? Is the asset allocation correct? Are you working with an advisor and paying too much in fees? Like, what are they actually doing for you? Yeah. We've got a lot of clients where it's like, when there's a comparison of what we do at YFP, versus like what an advisor somewhere else would do, it's a different offer. And again, I think that the nice thing about Gen X is that they're not shut out of the game of like financial services like Gen Y, because Gen X at least has investable assets that can be managed. And that's typically what advisors look for. So, if you have negative wealth and no money to invest, most advisors will say, I can't help you. Gen X doesn't necessarily have that problem because they, if they've changed careers, if they've accumulated money in their IRAs over time, they do get attention. But is it the right attention? Is what I would argue.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that we haven't talked about that's about this is the protection stuff of the financial plan. So, over time, things change. So are your life and disability stuff? Are you, what are the deductibles? Do you need an umbrella policy? We could probably go back to the estate that we had Cameron Huddleston on, or the episode that we had Cameron Huddleston on, which is Mom and Dad, we need to talk. So not just having estate documents for you and an estate plan for you, but your parents. But it's also like, it could be where you are to a point as a Gen Xer where there is more that you can potentially give. And, maybe there's charitable intentions and it could be sometimes we see with Gen Xers, that have worked some of these things, it's kind of that big pot of money syndrome. So it's like, I have $80,000, I have money in my investments, but I have $80,000 in savings account. I'm like, okay, well, what's this money for?
Yeah.
Like, what are we earmarking it for? And then if we're expecting inheritance, like what's that going to be used for? Have we reviewed our emergency fund lately? So there's so many things here that I think Gen X, especially as they kind of proceed through and they're really approaching their peak years of earnings, just need to make sure that they're not on. I hear autopilot all the time when it comes to a financial plan, but that's there's typically tons of things to look at and do and plan for and assess. And as you're taking care of parents and sending kids to college, and the one thing we haven't talked about is taxes and what that looks like. There's just a lot. There's just a lot on the plate, and to me, it just goes back to the idea of sitting down and building out a plan, but then, kind of engage in the act of planning as the years go on and you're kind of in this last decade or two of earning, so you can set yourself up for the best retirement that you can.
Two resources, Tim, I want to point folks to that build on some of what we've been talking about here. You mentioned that interview with Cameron Huddleston, who wrote Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk. Great conversation I had with her about how to effectively talk with your parents about their finances. So many good takeaways that I've been able to apply in my situation. That was episode 108, and we'll link to that in the show notes. And then the second thing, we've been talking a little bit about kids' college education, and that was episode 195, where we talked about how to save for your child's education, and that highlights some of what you're sharing in the third approach. Tim, one of the things I want to ask you about is, I suspect many in Gen X, you've given some data here about folks that, may not be on track, quote, statistically, or what they think they should be in terms of retirement savings. There's probably that lingering feeling of like, I'm behind, right? I'm also maybe trying to pay off some student loan debt, but I've got all these other competing expenses that are taking on some of the priority as well. And so the question here relates to how to get past that inertia of feeling behind. The best time to invest would have been 20 years ago, but the next best time is right now. Right. And so how do you begin to coach folks through, not having that mindset or approach of like, well, at this point, I haven't done it. And so therefore I'm not going to be able to get to that goal anyways.
Yeah. I think I kind of equate it to like, for some people, it's like going to the doctor. Like you don't want to go to the doctor and them talking about like if you smoke or if you're overweight or things like that. Like you have this block that, that the answer is bad. And there's kind of like this feeling of being judged. But I think from the professional standpoint, we've seen it. We've seen a lot of things, just like doctors have seen it all. Right. So it's not about that. It's just about kind of changing course and saying, okay, this is what happened, or this is what's happening. How can we make this better? How can we proceed? And the thing that, and I hear this all the time, even from clients that we have that are younger, that are in their 20s, but I hear it throughout all the generations. Really, it's like I'm never going to be able to retire. I'm always going to be working. And I think for Gen X in particular, because of some of the downfalls, the downfalls in the market, and the overage, the investment in education, kind of being underemployed at least from the beginning. That is that pessimism. So there was a study by, I think it was T. Rowe Price, that said, 12% of Gen Xers say that they were retired before age 60 compared to 26% of millennials. So millennials are more optimistic about that. But I guess to kind of bring it back in terms of like kind of where to start, my belief in financial planning is very absolute. Meaning, like, I think if you engage with a professional, kind of an objective third party that has your best interest in mind and is really rooting for you to, achieve the goals that you want. I think if you do that for years, we have people that really do well with their financial plan in a span of a year or two or even three. But if you can imagine stacking a decade, if I'm a Gen Xer and I'm 50, and I know that I have a decade left if I want to retire by 60, you can do a lot in 10 years. You can. Right. So like, and if you're a younger Gen Xer, if you're 41, if you're my brother's age, 1980, and you have, say, 20 years or even 25 years, there's just so much that you can do in 20 years if you're stacking intentional years of working on your financial plan and thinking about it and revising your goals and making adjustments and protecting yourself and having those conversations of like, hey, is this what I really want? And am I on track? There's kind of like this feeling, and I think that's, I think sometimes that happens with our clients, even just through the first meeting where they just look at and they can see their balance sheet and all of their things. And then even more so after the second meeting where we're actually talking about like, what are their goals? What is a wealthy life for you? Just to have that exercise, to go through that exercise, I think is empowering. And then it's kind of like, all right, let's get to work and actually get into the financial plan. And so I look at it as very much a glass half full. Whereas I think a lot of people, it's a glass half empty. And we know that like inertia is a thing, right? So you're more likely to kind of do what you're doing currently than to take the leap to do something different. So, I think to answer your question, that you originally answered, I think it's just kind of you have to get over that, because at the end of the day, like you're going to have to get over it eventually, whether it's you're in your 40s or if you're in your 60s, where you have to like actually plan to say, okay, can I shut this income stream off that is my livelihood? Because eventually, if you're a farmer, you can't do the work as a pharmacist in your age. It's like really hard to do. It's a demanding profession. So like to me, it has to come sooner or later. And then as a planner, I would advocate sooner. So, and I would just think of it from like just thinking of it from like a patient perspective. I'm sure lots of pharmacists work with patients would have those anxieties. But if you kind of approach it as like, well, they've probably seen it all, which we have, then just have solace in that like, you're not going to be judged, or it's just more about moving forward from here than anything. So that's the best advice I can give. But I know like, I get it. Like I understand. And no one wants to be judged, or sometimes we double down because pharmacists are your doctors, you're educated, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a doctor of money. Right. So, but we put that on ourselves, or, PharmDs put that on themselves, that like they should know better or things like that. And I just think that's crap, to be honest. And I think Gen X, again, you're kind of dealt a kind of a, not a great hand, because you're in that kind of sandwich where, baby boomers, my parents are baby boomers. They're like, buy a house, don't have credit card debt. But I didn't necessarily want to buy a house right away. Like, that was what you did. You got the best education, so you would pay whatever you could to get the best job. You buy a house and you have kids, and that's it. But like that wasn't for me. But I feel like Gen Xers were still kind of put in that, so they had that appetite for the non-student loan debt, but then they also had the student loan debt that baby boomers didn't experience. So that's the thing that I have to, I would say, like, it's cool. Like, that's kind of where you were at in terms of the run of things. And then I think millennials learn from baby boomers and Gen X, and we're like, I don't want to rush into marriage or a house or things like that. I want to kind of figure this out first. And you had a little bit more, I think, leeway even than Gen Xers did, because like Gen Xers, again, because of all the different, recessions and things like that. So that, I think that's where and even things like forgiveness, like Gen Xers are probably looking at forgiveness and they're seeing all these, things come off the board here, like all these loans, like, PSLF and things like that.
I wish.
Yeah. And they're like, that would have been nice, because it went back in my day, shake their cane. But back in my day, like, this is how I had to walk uphill to school in the snow. Like those are some of the things that you weren't afforded those, because I think it was President George W. Bush that put that into effect, back in the early 2000s. So that's the thing, Tim, is like, it's not a great hand, but I think at the end of the day, like it's what you make of it going forward. And again, the nice thing about Gen X is that a lot of these problems, I think, are fixable because there's still time. There's still time, and they're approaching peak income earning years, like I said. And it's just, again, it's kind of more of the process of planning and making sure that like what they're doing is what they want to do.
Yeah, the thought that comes to mind too, Tim, is it's a great opportunity to reignite the vision, and I think that I'm thinking about all the issues we're talking about that are getting thrown at Gen X, and like, it's fair that you might feel beaten down and you feel like, man, I'm behind, or I wish I'd done this, or I wish I'd done that. Like, but to reignite the vision a little bit of, okay, where are we trying to go? What are we trying to achieve? And hopefully that provides some motivation to get over some of the humps to be able to accelerate the plan into the future. One other thing I want to ask you about, Tim, we're going to come back and talk about a lot of these in more detail into the future. So this episode is really meant to lay the foundation of some of the financial issues that Gen X is facing. And so we're going to come back and talk about Social Security in great detail into the future, which I think is relevant for folks that are in benefit, for folks that are getting ready for benefit decisions, and for even younger practitioners that are maybe asking some questions around, well, how do I factor this in? And what might this mean in terms of my long-term planning savings? And so I think there's a little bit for everyone to learn as it relates to Social Security. But Tim, from Gen X's perspective, talk to us about confidence in Social Security or lack thereof, and how this may factor into some of what they're working and facing through.
Yeah. So I think there's a T. Rowe Price article that basically said that there's very, very little confidence in Social Security. I think it's something like 56% of Gen X expects that Social Security will be bankrupt by the time they retire. And a full 73% agree with the statement that I'm expecting some Social Security benefits when I retire, but nothing as generous as what today's retirees get. So I think there's two different things at play there. Is one is, will Social Security not be there at all when I retire in 10 or 20 years as a Gen Xer, versus will it be there, but at a diminished amount? So I don't think that, I'm kind of the camp that I think Social Security will always be there in some form or fashion, but I do think that it'll be either funded with a tax increase or like a payroll increase or something like that, or it will be a diminished benefit, either, pushing out for retirement age or just a lower amount. So I think a good exercise for a Gen X, and I just did this recently just to check, is to go on the socialsecurity.gov website and just, you can sign in and actually see like what your full retirement age is, like if you retire at this age versus this age, like what your benefit would actually be if you have all of the quarters that you need to do to qualify for Social Security. So I think this warrants probably a full episode, but the confidence is not there, and I hear it, and it diminishes. Like baby boomers, they feel pretty good about it because a lot of them are approaching, or if they're not already drawing on it. Gen Xers very cynical about it, and I think Gen Y is like, yeah, I'm not counting on it. But at the end of the day, like, and we plan as if it's not going to be there, but at the same time, I think it will be, and I think it'll be a much lower percentage of your retirement paycheck than like the average American. But it's going to be there nonetheless. It's just a matter of like, what would that be? So at the end of the day, I think it's always smart to kind of plan for retirement as if it's going to be you all the way. But I don't see it going bankrupt. I think there's a lot of people that I respect and follow in the industry that says it'll be there. It might be a diminished benefit, but at the end of the day, it will be a part of your retirement paycheck, Gen X and even Gen Y, as we proceed here.
Yeah, Tim, this reminds me a little bit of some of the discussion around loan forgiveness. Like, not to say there won't be, changes or challenges to Social Security. I think that's been well documented. But, some of the fear and angst around public service loan forgiveness, we have to think about too, what would be the fallout if the plug got pulled, right? I mean, there's a lot of people, especially with Social Security, more so than loan forgiveness, that would, especially if you're 10 years away or less to retirement, like, that's a big deal, and so, might there be transitionary phases or smaller changes made along the way? Same thing with, loan forgiveness. We talk about making sure we're objectively evaluating some of those risks, considering them, but also looking at some of the upside of the plan. And I like your, suggestion and solution of, hey, let's plan as if it may not be there, and perhaps even running some, best case, worst case, middle of the road type of scenarios, and seeing how that fits out in terms of other savings that we have and how Social Security would be complemented by that.
Yeah, and funding aside, like it kind of makes sense. Like I wouldn't be surprised because we live longer. Like I think we're just living longer, so it kind of makes sense for us to work longer than previous generations because people are just living longer. So like I think the fallout of it's what we said about the loan forgiveness is that people are on track to like count on this program. So for the government to say, hey, psych this kid in, at a minimum, I think it would be grandfathered in. And I think if Social Security would ever go away, which I don't think it would ever would, but I think it would at least be grandfathered in terms of like you're counting on this. So anybody born after, year 2100 or something like that, then maybe that's not, but I think a lot of people, because we are really poor at saving for our future, it's a necessity that I think needs to happen. It's a kind of a forced way for us to save for retirement. We pay for it out of our paycheck, so we have to save for retirement. And one of the things that was a big headline as baby boomers were going to retire is that they were going to bankrupt the system, right? Yeah. And I read I think somewhere that Gen Xers will outnumber baby boomers by I think year 2028. So that's not too far away. So I think the dynamics and the numbers are changing. There's going to be, again, a big transfer of wealth from generation to generation, which again could buoy some of these years of not necessarily doing a great job of saving for the future. And again, that would be where I would have a plan for that. I remember my parents received a small inheritance, and I think they redid their kitchen. So if that's the goal, then that's great. But I would also want to make sure that everything is on the up and up in terms of retirement. I think, and that's going to be more so the case for a Gen X pharmacist, where they have to go further to save for their own retirement, because the Social Security benefit, it'll be there, but a much smaller percentage of that paycheck that you're going to build in retirement. So I think you're going to want to have the 401k and the IRAs and some of these other accounts there to kind of build that out. So yeah, I think, Tim, is probably one of the things that we should probably dedicate a few episodes on, is just kind of that whole picture of what that looks like in terms of Social Security and some of those other things that are going on as you're approaching, retirement age.
Great stuff, Tim. Again, intention here was to do somewhat of a high-level overview, some of the financial issues and challenges facing Gen X pharmacists that are in the YFP community. We're going to dig into some more of these topics in the future. And for those that are listening to this episode and you find yourself, thinking about many of these different priorities, financially, whether you're currently working with a planner, looking for a second opinion, not working with a planner, we'd love to have the opportunity to talk with you to see if the services at YFP Planning are a good fit for you. You can schedule a free discovery call at yfpplanning.com. And again, as we get ready to turn the calendar into 2022, just another thank you to those that take time out of their schedule each week to listen to the podcast. We don't take that for granted. We appreciate the feedback and the encouragement that we get. If you have ideas for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Wishing everyone a happy and healthy new year, and looking forward to seeing everyone in 2022. Today's episode of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast was sponsored by our friends at Thoughtful Wills. If you haven't created your estate plan yet, we urge you to reach out to Notesong and Nathan. They draft custom estate planning documents like wills, trusts, healthcare directives, and durable powers of attorney that fit your situation and reflect your wishes. This is key. These are custom legal documents created and reviewed by actual attorneys. Thoughtful Wills created 2 cut-to-the-chase packages designed for pharmacists who are ready to get their estate planning in order. You'll really appreciate their dedication to approachable lawyering, and they charge about half of what most law firms charge for the same documents. These documents are such a gift to your loved ones. If you haven't created them yet, please just get it done. Reach out to Notesong and Nathan by going to thoughtfulwills.com/YFP. Go ahead and book a meeting with them. They'll take such good care of you. As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.